H-2A visas, so much more, as well as talking a little bit about what does that look like for the dairy sector and maybe some different ways that you can look at immigration visa options for your farm. But before we dive into that this afternoon, I have a thank you to our current sponsor of the Dairy Signal, and that is Zinpro. And for over 50 years, Zinpro has pioneered the research and development of performance trace minerals. And they have innovative solutions that improve the health and well-being of both animals and people. As a family-owned, privately held company, their strategy for growth has come as a result of quality products, expert staff, and a commitment to helping their customers achieve more through science-based trace mineral nutrition. To learn more about their industry-leading tools and solutions, head over to Zimpro.com. And a huge thank you to them for their support of the Dairy Signal. I also have to say right off the bat here that this is the last week of the Dairy Signal for 2025, and we are headed into, gosh, what already feels like a crazy 2026 in a good way. But I just want to give folks a reminder that if you are listening here today, we have one more episode on Thursday here before we are off for 2 weeks with the holidays coming up, especially coming up right over our Thursday episode. So we're taking a couple weeks off, but we'll see you in 2026. But with all that being said, we have a great episode today that we want to get to. And joining us this afternoon, we have Kyle Farmer, who's an attorney and owner at Farmer Law PC. And Kyle, we're excited to have you on here this afternoon as we talk about a topic that can be kind of hard to navigate. It's not the easiest of subjects to go about, especially as there's so much nuance. And it feels like a lot of the times when we're talking about immigration visas and the dairy sector, it gets a little bit difficult. So, looking forward to having a great discussion with you here this afternoon. But before we do so, would you mind giving us a little bit of an introduction about yourself?
Of course, yeah. And I appreciate the time and thanks for having me. Yeah, so I guess just a little bit of background on myself. I started my law firm, Farmer Law PC, right after law school. Farmer is my last name. It was always my last name, and it just happened to work out really nicely. After law school, I moved to Iowa with my wife, and while I was looking for a job, I started to help my father-in-law, who used H-2A visas in his business, figure out how he can use them. Well, he already used them, but figured out how to do them and how to bring the folks over here and which roles they can fill and that sort of thing. So started off doing that, and then from there just kind of grew into multiple different verticals within the agricultural industry in multiple different visa categories, all in an effort to provide a comprehensive labor solution to agricultural employers. So that's why I'm here today.
Well, we're excited to have the conversation because, as I mentioned before, it's one that gets complicated real quick. And there's nothing easy when it comes to government and visas and all of that good stuff. But, really before we dive in here, what's your experience with dairy? Because I know dairy is a little bit different when it comes into the mix of things. So just so we can get a little bit of level setting for the folks out there, what's your experience on this side of the world?
I've worked with a lot of dairies. I've worked with dairies that just run dairies. I've worked with dairies that have row crop operations. I've worked with all sorts of dairies, and it's not with anything with dairies. It's all specific to that dairy, what that dairy needs. So there's not necessarily like a good, this is the perfect immigration strategy for dairies generally. Dairies are generally well familiar with the H-2A program, and they're usually really irritated with it because of the temporary or seasonal requirements of the visa. But that's not their only means of finding people and having people work on their farms. But it is the one that they, I think, have the most exposure to and get frustrated the most with. And it's also the one that they're rightfully pushing for legislative change on the most. But yeah, no, got lots of familiarity with dairies generally. Have plenty of dairy clients, and I love working with them. It is particularly fun with dairies because my favorite part is to see which tool in the toolbox is actually right for that business, which is, I think, a bit different than most people where they have a hammer and they want everything to be a nail, but that's not how it actually works.
Oh, if only. It would make life a little bit easier, it seems some days. But that's also where the fun comes into it with
Yeah.
dairy farming. But Kyle, I have to say, where we're getting started here, I want to make sure that we're all on a level set. So let's talk about, the H-2A program in general, and how does it differ from other visa programs specifically for agriculture workers?
Sure. Yeah. So I just at a high level, what is the H-2A program? The H-2A program is a temporary or seasonal agricultural visa. So it's meant for workers on a farm. It's really great because it's not numerically capped. I think that the one big pitfall, particularly in the dairy industry, is the temporary or seasonal requirement. Most work on dairy farms is year round, and so that's where they struggle because they would really be able to benefit from a visa program that allows that. The dairy industry has pushed certain legislative changes, like the Farm Workforce Modernization Act of 2019 and of 2021, and those sorts of things. I think that kind of overcomplicates the issue a little bit, if I'm being honest. But at a high level, that's what H-2A is. Temporary or seasonal agricultural visas. It's not numerically capped.
So I think you bring up a really good point that a lot of the times when thinking about, H2As, it's a discussion in dairy that is an issue where it's, temporary. That word is really what sticks out. So why is H2A the one that is discussed with dairy, or why has it been something that is really exposed most often to agriculture in general? Is it because it fits most molds,
Mhm.
and dairy just happens to fall outside of that? But why is that the one we hear the most about?
Yeah, if you just Googled agricultural visa, it's the one that would pop up. It's been around for a long time. It is a very used program. It's become more and more used. And I think as it's become harder and harder to find U.S. workers willing to do this type of work, that it's made it to where the dairy industry's had to look around a lot more and say, well, what about us? And for a lot of their roles, if you've got someone that's just milking cows, it's not a great visa for them because there's not a seasonal component to it, and then there's compliance issues with it if you do use it for those types of purposes. So that I think really the real reason that it's the most focused on one is because it's the most obvious visa that could be applicable to dairies that just simply isn't for the temporary or seasonal aspect. That's the only thing that keeps dairies out.
So, as dairy farmer in general, I think about, there are so many farms that really depend on having labor that is from immigrants, and that covers a lot of different areas of, well, you have a lot of things you have to think about on the farm, and that's a big one is finding that labor source. And if they have some great people that are willing to be that labor source, that becomes kind of an issue somewhere along the lines. But how do you recommend dairies plan for immigration and having that labor source, especially amid policy uncertainty?
Yeah, and I think that's a good question. And one thing that I've seen with dairies a lot is they've had the same employees for a long time, and maybe their employees have questionable legal status, but they've had the same people for a long time. And it's really hard whenever you have policies that vary so wildly, every few years on enforcement. And it becomes really tough, especially just from a human aspect of it. When you're the one employing the person, you actually do become close to that person. You want a solution for that person, and the reality is that a lot of times there's not a solution for that person, and that sucks. But that's how that is. Like that's immigration law. So how do I recommend that dairies approach their labor? It's generally the way that I do it is I know a bunch of different visa categories. We've got ways of also placing people domestically that have lawful working status that we've used with dairies that's been great. And that doesn't require any immigration work. And But the real trick is to work with someone that understands all of these different things and then tells you which puzzle piece is supposed to go where. Because the thing that I always see dairies fall into, I know I mentioned this, so I'm kind of beating a dead horse here, or cow in this circumstance. So stupid. My kids would love that joke. But is they want to say like, okay, I'm going to use TN visas for everything, and then I'll tell them be like, hey, you shouldn't use TNs for that, and they're like, well, what's my other option? And then you kind of can go into what their other options are. But for dairies, it's really hard, and the lack of availability for most jobs for H-2A makes it even harder. I think that one thing that is interesting though, from an H-2A perspective, is you really need to know what it means to be temporary or seasonal in nature, particularly seasonal in nature. Because what most dairy farmers say is, I'm busy year round. And so their analysis of if they're seasonal starts and ends with how busy they are year round. That's not how it actually works. That the question becomes, you're busy doing what year round? And so what I like to do with dairy farmers is I like to take them through just a progression of their year. There are certain things that they do over the course of the year that are the same from month to month. The volume output is the same from month to month. And so in that circumstance, like those tasks are not good for H2As. But there are certain times where dairy farmers are actually engaged in some sort of seasonal work and they just don't know it because that guy that they've had for 20 years happens to be uniquely qualified to fill both roles. And so it's like, yeah, no, he's busy year round. It's like, and I understand that, but he's busy doing what? Because that helps to draw a distinction between what work you're performing is seasonal and what work you're performing is not seasonal.
So that brings up a really interesting, but, thought-provoking question of, when we're thinking about seasonal and temporary and the struggles, I think a lot of the times when we talk about that is that one of the biggest costs for having a new hire is the onboarding process and that time in order to take to get that person to that level in which you need them to be on the farm, especially, and getting them to that standard that's needed. So I think a lot of that, discussion comes around, okay, well, if I'm hiring somebody temporarily, and then they're gone after that time frame. I have to
Mhm.
start that process all over again, in terms of training, getting them where they need to go, and then all of a sudden they're gone again. Where sometimes it is easier to cross train and have that person all year round. But it is an interesting aspect to think about, especially when it comes to options available and the labor that is available. And you've mentioned a couple different times, when we're talking about visa programs, there's H-2A, but there's also other options. So when it comes to dairy specifically, and I know there's a lot of nuance and gray area in here, but when it comes to dairy farms, what are some of those options for farms to be thinking about as a holistic view, whether that be the temporary side of things, the long-term side of things? What are some of those other common threads that you pull to get
Yeah,
where we
of
need to
course.
go?
Yeah, and one of the things you brought up a second ago about H2As is something I hear all the time, which is I don't want to be stuck in this process of retraining people every year. For virtually every single one of our clients, that's not how that works because they bring the same worker back year after year. So you train them and then they go home and then they come back and they don't come back untrained, they come back trained, which is really nice. That's actually one of the huge benefits of H2As. You are bringing back a person that works in your company culturally, physically, capably, and they come back year after year. They're happy to be there, happy to do the work. And so I do hear that all the time, but that's not usually how that works. Now, so sorry, your question was about what are the other
Options, yes.
options for them. So a lot of dairy farmers are familiar with the TN visa category.
Mhm.
And the TN visa category fits well within certain dairies. Uh, just at a high level, what is the TN visa category? It was a visa that was created by NAFTA. It was carried over in the USMCA. I expect it will be again next year. Again, not numerically capped, specific to people from Canada and Mexico. and it's for a certain designated list of professionals to engage in professional level activity. So the spots where I normally see that, dairy scientist is one of the roles that they can fill. So is animal scientist, animal breeder. There's all sorts of roles. I think the animal breeder is probably the most common, at least most commonly applied properly for dairies. Um, and so, yeah, the T and Visa category can be good. Another thing that we do is we've built a huge network of people that are in the United States that have lawful working status. So they might have an EAD card or a green card. They might even be citizens and are just looking for consistent, reliable work. And that's been a great resource for dairies in particular because a lot of their jobs don't meet the criteria of the other two things, which is why we built out that huge funnel of people, was because of producers like dairies that don't fit cleanly for all of their roles with H-2As or TNs. And so we've come up with another strategy for placement of people.
Well, first, I appreciate you clarifying that H-2A, especially on the temporary roles and how a lot of times those folks come back. That is a great clarification. I also have to say that, I appreciate you going through just a couple of the different options. But, when we're talking about going back to H-2A specifically, when we're looking at compliance and requirements of employers and all of that good stuff, what are some of the key areas that employers need to be aware of? And oftentimes, where do they have mistakes or pitfalls?
Oh boy, where do they have mistakes and pitfalls? That is almost everywhere. They so there's a long list. H2A is extremely compliance oriented. I would say that probably the most impactful place that farmers, especially dairy farmers, for example, would have serious compliance concerns would be a result of them not reading their job order. The job order is just the first step, and it's called the ETA 790. It's the first step in the H-2A application process where you talk about the experience requirements, the jobs being performed, all that sort of stuff. And the Department of Labor changed the wage rate methodology in 2023, I think. That feels right. I could be on or off a year, give or take a year. I'm pretty sure it was 2023. And this was actually just recently modified by the Trump administration, definitely for the good. The modification that they made is extremely helpful for farmers, but farmers will still fall in the same trap, which is they have a list of job functions that are being performed, and this influences the wage that they're paying if those jobs fall outside of what the Department of Labor calls the Big Six. I think that dairy farmers would inadvertently put themselves in the Big Six just by broadly describing their jobs, but they might have jobs like maybe they bring over someone and this person happens to be able to get a CDL and they were like, "Oh, okay. Well, I can replace what you're doing over there, and I'm going to use you to drive trucks." And that would have huge wage rate implications because they would be paid a different wage. Department of Labor really doesn't like that, and so I think that that's probably the biggest one that they fall into. Another one isn't really the fault of the dairy or the agricultural producer, but this one happens all the time in the H2A world, which is why I built out my own recruitment and processing company was because I don't like this. But a lot of times, so the H2A visa has a prohibition against H2A workers paying for the job opportunity. And if this is not something that's carefully tracked to ensure that it's not happening, it can happen. And the problem from the agricultural producer's perspective is it doesn't matter if they knew about it or not. They might have not benefited from it at all. They might have had some employee that worked for them for the last 20 years. They got deported and is now down in Mexico helping them recruit for H-2A. And that person who they've known for 20 years is charging people for the opportunity to come on an H-2A visa. Let's say that they're bringing in 50 people and they're charging each person $2,000. Well, the Department of Labor is going to fine you, the employer, $100,000, 2,000 for each of the 50 people, and then fine you probably close to $3,000 a worker for that violation. So you'd be out $250,000 or whatever that math comes out to. No, it's not that much. Yes, it is. It's $250,000. Uh, that you'd be out $250,000 for something you had nothing to do with. And so that kind of thing comes up a lot. Usually the big things for the Department of Labor, and I think in large part rightfully so, is the Department of Labor really wants to make sure that U.S. workers are not being negatively impacted and that the foreign workers are not being exploited in any way. That doesn't mean exploited by the employer. It just means exploited through the process. And so it's important because I have, I don't know that I've ever run across an employer that exploited workers in any capacity. Uh, I have run across circumstances where the employer didn't know someone was like charging for a visa, um, and so those are the main things that the Department of Labor is looking for. But it's a very compliance oriented program. I'll say one more thing because this one also trips up dairy farmers or farmers generally. I shouldn't even just pick on dairy farmers because they don't mean to. But let's say that you are a dairy farmer and you have a row crop operation and you bring in H-2A workers for your row crop operation. And let's say that those H-2A workers are paid $18 an hour and you have US workers that make $16 an hour. A lot of times they won't even know to increase their US workers to the H-2A workers' wage rates. And so they'll owe back wages to the U.S. workers. So that kind of thing happens all the time. It's something the Department of Labor is looking at. And again, it all goes back to is it adversely affecting the U.S. worker or is it exploiting the foreign worker?
So that's really good areas to be thinking about. And a couple questions from that. When you're talking about specifically that situation or the example that you gave with somebody who was working on the farm, they got their CDL, and now you're having them drive truck. How would you come back into compliance? Would they just not be able to drive truck? What would you do in that situation?
That's a great question. So the way you come back into compliance is you would first of all stop making them drive the truck. And then if you want them to drive the truck, file a job order that properly reflects the job being performed, and then see if you get any U.S. workers for the job. And if you don't, then you could transfer the worker from the other certification onto the new one. So they don't have to like go back to Mexico or anything like that, but you would be able to transfer them from one position to the other.
So yep, you just have to do those couple of other extra steps in order to make sure it's all kosher from the sounds of it.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. So then one of the other questions that I have from what you were just talking is when you're thinking about, not exploiting others in that situation with the Department of Labor and say, you don't know though those situations are happening, but do you know or have any best practices for folks that work with agents or third-party recruiters to make sure that, they're not going to fall into some of that pitfalls?
Yes, I do. So what we do is everyone that works on our recruitment team has an agreement that they won't charge people for the opportunity to work. Uh, every worker that we process signs an agreement that says that they were not charged. Everything we put out on social media has a disclosure that no one should be charged for the opportunity to work. And we've got a huge following in Mexico. I think we've got like over 100,000 people that follow us. And so it's really if it's happening with who you're working with, then you just shouldn't be working with them because it's a lot harder to rein that back in. It becomes a cultural problem of your partner more so than something that you can easily rectify. And so, if that's a concern, people could obviously reach out to us. But like let's just say hypothetically that happened within our own business, we would have a zero tolerance policy for that. I mean, there would be no question that person would be let go immediately because that's just not. It's contrary to the core of who we are. Um, and so it is really hard. But now, best practices: get those no charge agreements from the recruiters, get no charge agreements from the foreign nationals, and then before the workers return to their home country, have them sign another acknowledgement that they didn't pay for the opportunity to work. And those all serve different purposes, but all three checkpoints are very important.
So now I'm going to talk about if you're in that situation where you're like, oh gosh, I didn't even know this was a thing. Say worst case scenario, and they're like, you know what? I can't confirm or deny that it did or did not happen, that, maybe somebody did have to pay for the opportunity to work and you just didn't know about it, kind of in
Yeah.
some of those situations you were talking about. At this point, is there anything that somebody needs to do in order to, I don't want to say come back in compliance, because like you said, you can't walk that one back too much when there's stuff that's been done.
So yeah, so what do you need to do? Basically, if you found out it happened, you need to conduct a investigation into it. Um, and depending on the circumstances, sometimes the internal HR team can do it. Oftentimes, it's better that that's outsourced to an unrelated third party, just because the Department of Labor could view it uh, as you having an incentive to find nothing. So it's better outsourced. There is an obligation to report it to the Department of Labor and the Department of Homeland Security, and so after you need to follow those steps, conduct an investigation and report.
And I can see how having a third party would be really beneficial in this, um, especially since it sounds like it can get messy really quick if you don't have the right people working with you.
Yeah, yeah. And what you might end up having to do, even without the Department of Labor telling you to, is reimburse those workers what they were charged. But that if I'm a agricultural producer and I heavily rely on H-2A program, for example, my options are either do that and reduce my risk of a petition revocation or a debarment. And I also reduce my risk of civil money penalties from the Department of Labor. And so, in the example I gave you earlier, they might be out $100,000, but they're not out $250,000, and they still have the integrity of their program. And so, it's not a great situation to be in. But the other thing is, whenever you go through a third party vendor for the investigation, they might find out that, 100 workers didn't pay for this, but five did. And I've seen it where the Department of Labor found out that five people did, and they tried to apply that to all 100 when that wasn't actually the case. And so that is nice about having an independent um, person actually investigate it for you is they can get down to the truth of the matter. What really happened here? What do you need to pay? And then what's your process for coming back into compliance, as you said?
Okay. So one of the other areas that I know a lot of producers think about when they have folks coming to work for them on their farms is a lot of times there's housing and vehicles and transportation involved. So when thinking about employers and from that side of things, how can they protect themselves from the liability related to housing, transportation, wage requirements, etc., specifically, with these workers?
Yeah, so the housing is it's generally inspected by the state workforce agency prior to certification. So at the time of certification, you know that you have compliant housing. One thing that does happen, and again, this isn't the fault of the farmers at all, but The workers will do something to modify the housing to take it out of compliance. So a good example of that is maybe the state workforce agency requires screens on screen doors, and the workers want to take the screen off and just have the door open so they can come in and out easily. They can just leave the door open when they're eating. Like they just like it more. Well, employers need to make sure that the employees know that they can't be doing that kind of stuff. They can't be making modifications to the housing that drops out of compliance because at the end of the day, it's the employer's responsibility. And so they need to do that. Same thing with they don't inspect vehicles, but they can. The Department of Labor has a form for inspection to ensure compliance. If you, For certain H-2A filers, they're called farm labor contractors or H-2A LCs or H-2A labor contractors. You can call them whatever you want, but they actually have to get their vehicles inspected, and the Department of Labor has a form for it. I really like whenever farmers aren't required to have those, but they do, because it shows that their vehicles were in compliance at the time and maintain compliance. So you can just do little stuff like that that really helps quite a bit.
So I want to take, probably should have started here, but I want to take a little bit of a step back when we're talking about the H-2A program, specifically for those who might be considering, getting started, or is this the program that's right for them? So let's talk through or walk through just some of the steps and some of the things to consider when moving forward with, you know, is this right? What's the timeline in order for this, usually from start to finish, from starting the process until having somebody on the farm, as well as, the cost.
Yeah,
What is that to the farm?
sure.
There's a lot of dependencies in there.
Yeah, no, no, the cost can vary quite wildly. But the so let's talk through the process. So let's say that you're a dairy farm and you don't even know if you qualify to begin with. Well, the first step would be to talk to someone that knows if you qualify or not. And the way that I do that is like I told you earlier. I'll get with the farmer and I'll say, okay, you're busy year round. I'll go ahead and give you that, but you're busy doing what? And then we'll go through that process, and I'll tell them, where H2A might fit into their workflow, where and where it shouldn't. And then the let's say that you say, okay, that's great, Kyle. I want 5 people for that. Uh, so what we do is we work with the farmer on drafting the job order or the ETA 790. The regulations require that you file that 60 to 90 days in advance. Whenever you file that, it gets put into the state workforce agency system and the Department of Labor system. And this triggers the state workforce agency to reach out to you, the farmer, about setting up a housing inspection. So you want to make sure that prior to the state workforce agency getting there, that your housing is meeting the standards, the applicable standards for the housing. They'll come there, they'll check the housing and verify that it does. And then meanwhile, we would be filing what's called a 9142A with the Department of Labor. We would be drafting a support statement to explain to the Department of Labor why this meets the regulatory requirements, all that sort of stuff. That will eventually get certified by the Department of Labor, and then you file a form. It's called an I-129 with the Department of Homeland Security. And then after that is whenever you get that approval, you can process workers, or you can use that to transfer workers to you from another employer. So yeah, I mean that's kind of the process in a nutshell. From our company's perspective, what we do is we do everything nuts to bolts. Like we don't do the housing inspection. That's about it. But worker processing, recruitment, transportation, logistics, all that sort of stuff, we just handle it all. Um, in terms of the cost, the cost does vary a lot. It varies a lot based on the number of people that you're bringing, the number of people on each petition that you're bringing, where they're coming from, all that sort of stuff. So
So, one of the questions that I have for you then, and I don't mean to say that you're not able to take on everybody who gives you a call and says, "Hey, I need some help with my H-2A," and all of that. But, how does somebody find a reliable resource like yourself who is set up and has the systems in place, who knows how all of these visas work and what's right for the individual farm and entity itself? What are some good ways to know if, whomever they're talking to is going to actually be right for the job and situation of making sure that the paperwork's filed correctly, that, they're able to be compliant with the program and all of that, that it sounds like you do.
Yeah, I mean, the first question that I would ask is, how long have you been doing this? And you know, the reality is that if you haven't been doing this for quite a while, you won't have seen all of the different variables. The second question I'd be asking is, what all do you do? Do you do? And if the question is, well, we do H-2As, H-2Bs, and green card filings, you're like, okay, well, that probably isn't enough for me, especially in the dairy industry. The third question I'd be asking is, how many dairy farmers do you deal with? How long have you been dealing with dairy farmers specifically? And the reason that you ask that question is because there's a lot of people out there that quote unquote file H-2As. But they might be filing for strawberry pickers in California or something like that. The fourth question I'd be asking is, okay, what do I do when I have compliance questions? Who can give me compliance advice? And the reality is that non-lawyers should not be giving compliance advice for the H-2A program. And I know that a lot of them do, but they're also not supposed to. And I also don't know that they're capable of it because they haven't been through Department of Labor audits. They haven't been through those sorts of investigations, whether it's from the Chicago National Processing Center or if it's from the Department of the Wage and Hour Division. And so, and maybe they'd say, "Oh, we would refer you to one of our attorney partners or something like that." Well, from my perspective, the way I think about it is like I want to be talking to the same person. That's why we built it the way that we did, where we just do all of the things, because I don't know another vendor in the United States that does all of these things. That's and so that's why we built it this way, is because it makes it a lot harder, or it makes it a lot easier for clients to come to us and say, I need this, this, and this. And we say, great, we do all those things.
And I think that helps when thinking about, who folks are working with, because we have a lot of great folks in our bag and our toolkit when we need things like our veterinarians, our consultants. But when it comes to this area, it often feels like it's a lot harder to find that right resource. So those questions are really helpful to be able to ask and to have in the back of the mind when talking with folks. One of the areas, and I'm going to shift it a little bit, not specifically H-2A focused, but more on the labor side, being that you work in this realm and you've seen, and it sounds like you've been in here for quite a while, so you've seen some of the changes and dynamic shifts, especially in like the last 5 to 10 years. So from your perspective, and I know this is a little bit out of the box of the questions, but from your perspective, what have you seen as the biggest shift in labor? And is there any takeaways that dairy can be thinking about in terms of labor as, what's next? What should
Yeah.
they be aware of? What can they be thinking about?
Yeah. Yeah. And maybe even add to that question, what should they be pushing for? So the what do I see next? I kind of see more of the same. I think there's going to be a lot more enforcement still. Um, and and so I would expect that, and a lot of times it's not where the dairy farmer gets in trouble. It's usually not ICE coming in and raiding their farm or anything like that. It happens, but it's not that common. What happens most often is I, dairy farmer, have this person who's worked for me for 20 years and they're illegal and they are on their way to work and they get picked up by ICE because they get pulled over and don't have a driver's license. It's like that kind of thing happens all the time. And it puts them in a really hard spot because now instead of planning, they're reacting. Um, and so I think that planning is important. And what's changed over time is I think in large part the U.S. workforce's unwillingness to perform this type of work has become more and more significant, and I think that's just going to get worse. Like I don't think we're going to wake up tomorrow and then all of a sudden people are rushing to rural Wisconsin to come and work on a dairy farm. I just don't think that that's how our culture is anymore. Uh, which is a shame. I wish it was, but that's just that I think that's just the reality of it. Now, what should they be pushing for? If I were the dairy czar of America and all I needed was one thing, it would be simply to remove the temporary or seasonal aspect of the H-2A program for dairies. What I would not be doing is things like the Farm Workforce Modernization Act of 2019 or of 2021. Those bills, I understand why the dairy industry liked them. I think that it was in large part because from their perspective, what they think was, I have nothing now, and with this, I have something. But you were I think it's short-sighted. They had a numerical cap on the number of visas. Those would get eaten up within the first year, and then they would be extremely competitive. I've seen time and time again how numerical caps work with visas. And so they need to make sure that any legislation that they push through does not have some associated numerical cap. And I'm sure that'll piss off a lot of dairy farmers because they were really behind the Farm Workforce Modernization Act of 2019 and 2021. So sorry, guys. But I wasn't, and it wasn't because I don't want good things for dairies. It's because I could read it and understand the actual implications of it over the long term. So yeah, I mean, if I were them, I would just stay laser focused on just removing that aspect of the HOA program for them, and it would solve a lot of their problems.
I have to say, this is why I enjoy having folks on who we haven't had on before or, are maybe not directly related within the dairy sector as a dairy producer themselves but working adjacent is that you see things in a different light, and that's never a bad thing. And just because one person has a thought or opinion about something that, might have been beneficial for them, it is good to hear from those who can see from a different lens what the implications may be one way or another. So appreciate your candor on that. It's always interesting to hear other people's takes. I also have to say that when we're having these conversations, that I appreciate the ideas that it's not just dairy, it's agriculture as a whole, but there's certain areas that can be fixed or be better. But yeah, it just takes time. And
Yeah,
that's always the fun part is that it takes a lot of time to get anything moved through the US government system. But
I
you,
know.
Kyle, we are getting towards the end of our time here today, but before I ask you our last question, is there anything else that's been on your mind or anything that I missed when asking questions specifically about H-2A, dairy, or labor in that you're just like, gosh, this is my time to shine and I really want to share it?
No, no, I think you did a great job. I think your questions are great, and it kind of gets to the heart of what I talk about with dairies all the time. It's funny because I'm pretty sure that I talked about at the time the Farm Workforce Modernization Act to a bunch of dairies, and it was at oh man, I can't remember where it was. It might have been at like some dairy expo or something. And they were like, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, we like that." And then I was like, "Well, did you know these things are in it?" And they're like, "No, we didn't know that was in it." And then they started to say, "Well, then why the hell is my association pushing this on me?" And I was like, "Right, my point exactly. Thank you." But it is funny. So I also I completely understand that they liked it, that they were told to like it. And I also understand why the associations liked it because the associations felt like they were accomplishing something for their members. I just think that in the long run that would have been disastrous. But yeah, I mean, if you went on my website, I'm pretty sure I've got multiple videos just absolutely ripping that bill in it. And so I don't want to see something like that again, or I will be complaining about it for similar reasons. But yeah, I think, at the end of the day, I think that what can dairy farmers do? I think that they've got to work with someone that can really help them strategize, be more forward looking with their labor strategy as opposed to being reactive. And I also understand, if I'm a dairy farmer, I don't want to do that. Like I've got actual work to do. I would oftentimes rather save tomorrow's problems for tomorrow. The problem is that whenever you have tomorrow's problems, there's not always a tomorrow solution. And so it's one of those that you probably shouldn't save.
I appreciate, like I said before, the candor when it comes to these discussions, especially as they're not always the most popular of topics in general. This isn't always the most fun of topics, but appreciate your insight here this afternoon. And I know you did a great job wrapping it up there, but if you have one takeaway, one drive home point that you want producers to be thinking about or actively doing after today's conversation, and what would that be? Just for last thoughts.
Evaluating how you're using labor and planning for it over the next couple of years. And are you comfortable with that?
Perfect. With that, Kyle, thank you so much for your time here this afternoon. Appreciate your insights, especially as it comes to this topic that, there's a lot of gray area when it comes to the dairy sector, or maybe not necessarily gray area. Maybe we create the gray area where there really shouldn't be any. But with that being said, thank you so much for your time here today.
Thank you.
I also have to say thank you one more time to our sponsor for currently the month of December, and that is Zinpro. So thank you once again to them. Thank you to those folks who joined us and watched live, as well as those who are watching after. We appreciate you, and I hope you guys have a great rest of your Tuesday, and we'll see you here on Thursday. Bye now.